All right, so thank you everyone for joining us this morning. This is our second session of our week 5 of our Coach Socialization series. We started these series with an intent to provide a platform for coaches to connect, to continue to learn from one another, and to continue to learn from professionals on a variety of topics. So every Wednesday, we were hoping to have some sort of like workout theme. So this morning we have Craig, a strength and conditioning coach from Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic, with us. And he's going to be talking to us about recovery strategies and considerations, which is an essential part of working out and definitely a habit that you as coaches can start implementing for your athletes during this time. So Craig, you can take it away from here. I'll mute myself and he'll share his screen to present the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully we can all see this first slide there. So yeah, my name is Craig. I've been at the Sports Centre Atlantic for a few years now. Prior to that, I was in BC working at the Sport Institute there. I wanted to talk today about recovery strategy considerations with a special emphasis on sleep. We do spend about a third of our life in bed, and there are some other major recovery components as well, like nutrition and the mental recovery side of things. But I often refer to our nutritionists and our mental performance consultants for deeper dives into those topics. So I wanted to start off with just a couple graphical representations before moving into sharing some more practical information that can be used to help athletes that we work with. So when we simplify things down to just training and time, there are some dose-dependent responses we can anticipate. So this dashed gray line would kind of represent an athlete's baseline fitness. So if we hit them with a certain training load or workout or week of training, for example, we can expect that during or very shortly after that time for their fitness to kind of descend a bit, but then their recovery process takes place and we can expect their fitness level to jump back up. So there's a few different possible expected outcomes that could occur. So if we hit them with a stimulus that isn't a sufficient overload and the recovery is too high, then we can expect that they'll return to a very similar baseline fitness level. Alternatively, if we hit them with a really heavy training load or insufficient recovery, then we can expect that the recovery will not be sufficient enough to arrive back at a equal or higher baseline fitness level. And over time, that can lead to things like overreaching and perhaps even overtraining. Alternatively, and what we often strive for with athletes we work with is to hit them with progressive increases in training load and sufficient recovery so that their baseline fitness in a certain parameter, could be strength, for example, increases above its initial level gradually over time. And then we can get closer to competition where we try to peak these things. However, recovery isn't simply just a matter of time reliance. We have to ensure the time spent in recovery, whether this recovery is between sessions or days or something like a planned deload week, is being used efficiently. So this will be the focus of the presentation moving forward is, how can we impact the recovery practices of our athletes so that what we plan is what we get. So one more graph, and then, like I said, I'll keep it very practical, but I think this chart displaying an interaction between training loads and wellness kind of relates to what we're discussing. So with a couple of groups, I monitor athlete wellness and training loads. And I'm not going to go into too much detail around the data and the stats behind this work, but I do want to provide a brief overview again because it relates to the interaction between training loads and athlete wellness metrics. So in this example, athletes in a training group I work with receive a daily text where they respond to wellness questions on a 1 to 5 scale. So a 1 would be bad or problematic, and a 5 would be good or fine. So we look at desire to train, stress, irritability, soreness, fatigue, sleep quality, and sleep hours. And then each day we have a total wellness score. These are Z scores, but they just basically look at their overall wellness score and compare it to how it usually is. So if it's above 0, then that means their wellness on that day is a bit better than it typically is, and vice versa. If it's negative, their wellness is off in a poor trend. So we look at daily scores, we look at 3-day averages and 7-day averages just to see how the athletes are responding. So this bottom chart here also shows these daily wellness Z scores. So each date we have the Z score below 0 here we're seeing, and then a lot of above 0 are positive wellness scores here. The athletes also log training durations and intensities on a 1 to 10 scale. So if they have a 60-minute session, for example, and they rate that intensity at a 5 out of 10, then to calculate training load for that day, we'll multiply the 60 minutes by the intensity of 5. So the training load in arbitrary units would be 60 multiplied by 5, which would be 500. 60 multiplied by 300. So this gray line here gives us an idea of where the athlete's training loads are. And research has shown that, I should backtrack for a second here. So these training load lines are ratio lines of what the athlete has done over the past week compared to the past month. So if they had a really hard past week compared to what they were used to over the past month, then we expect the training load to be quite high. And research has shown that when this ratio of 7 to 28 days training load gets, at 1.5 and higher, and the athletes are at an increased risk of things like injury, illness, and overtraining. It should be noted, though, that sometimes we plan these, overreaching periods. It's a natural part of the training process, followed by periods of recovery, where we plan to reduce the training loads so that we can, again, get that recovery to see the adaptations we're looking for after the recovery. Now, during these increased training loads, we do expect small to moderate dips in wellness, as they're shown in research to be responsive to training loads. So things like sleep and mood have shown to be affected negatively by spikes in training loads. And again, it's a normal part of the training process, seeing moderate to small wellness changes. I will say that with this athlete, for example, though, these are dramatically negative wellness scores. One of these is a -2 Z score, and statistically, if a -2 Z score only happens, I think it's once out of every 100 days. So that's a pretty poor wellness score. So I'd be inclined to give the athlete the day off, for example, even though our focus is building up their training loads during this time. So in summary, we expect these small to moderate dips in wellness when we're increasing training loads. Dramatically, if we see dramatic changes, then we will look at adjusting training schedules. So over the past few years, though, a few things have stood out to me. Oftentimes, athletes will show these dips in wellness without associated training load increases. So this reiterates to me the life complexities of our young athletes. They're not full-time athletes. It's not just a simple process of sport training and recovery. They have heavy physical, cognitive, and social demands. Again, they're not full-time athletes, so we can't expect that our planned training schedules will always have the impact we have in mind. So due to these demands, the recovery habits of our athletes are so essential. They need to be in a state where they're prepared for these training demands that we have planned and the ability to recover from them. Many athletes are kind of lacking these foundational recovery practices and are unprepared for exposure to sufficiently high training loads to prepare themselves for appropriately improved performance. So we could argue maybe one reason why the athlete who experienced these increased training loads, maybe their wellness dipped so poorly because their wellness practices were not in place to handle these increased training loads. So if we can arm our athletes with education and the practice of healthy recovery habits, I think we can expect to see a lot smoother sailing and responses to our training programs, along with competition performance. So in terms of foundational recovery practices that I think we can all enforce to some extent or educate our athletes on, I think these are three big ones that really stand out. Nutritional habits, mental health and life stressor management, and sleep hygiene, which will be the big focus of the later part of this presentation. Then we also have, our more intermediate or advanced recovery practices, like planning active recovery after, intense training sessions, for example, foam rolling, encouraging the athletes to access therapy when needed. And then there's, the more advanced protocols like, hot and cold water immersion, compression therapies, etc. But I think the bulk of our athletes really need to focus on these foundational recovery practices. And I think these are practices that we can easily impact. So nutrition isn't one I'm going to spend much time on, again, because I'm not a nutritionist. And I'm sure at some point our nutritionists will give presentations relating to nutrition. But what can we easily impact or educate our athletes on? I think there's a few things. One is nutrition practices around training and competition. Other is food choices. I've seen athletes arrive to training sessions after school and consume, candy to fuel their workouts. We're not nutritionists, but I think we can generally tell the difference between appropriate and inappropriate food choices. Planning of daily meals and snacks. I think planning is probably maybe the biggest part of the nutrition flaws that our athletes have. A lot of them live at home. A lot of them aren't planning home prepared meals and snacks throughout the day. Most of our athletes should actually be eating every few hours, not full meals every few hours, but to some degree they should be eating, meals or snacks every few hours. And again, I don't think a lot of our athletes are planning out their days nutrition-wise. Hydration, we can use, simple like urine color guides. Like a white wine color, for example, is maybe a suggested urine color. There's different charts as well that could be provided to athletes to give them kind of an idea of what urine color should look like. And hydration time. So making sure athletes are hydrating, well before, not immediately before training, making sure they're hydrating sufficiently during training, and then they're replacing fluids loss after training. So we have, basic nutritional guidelines around exercise, for example, which I posted below. But again, I'm not going to go into much detail nutrition-wise because I'd rather leave that to the nutritionists within our sport network. Similarly, with mental health and stressor management, we have mental performance consultants through our sports center. So I will not go into too much depth on these topics. But again, what can we easily impact or educate our athletes on? I do think we can encourage planning of downtime, just again, due to the complexities of the lives of our athletes. So downtime itself can improve recovery, reduce psychological stress, reduce mental fatigue, improve mood, and reduce overall load. Earlier, I talked about the training load ratio. So looking at what the athlete has done over the past week compared to the past month physically. But I've also considered how something like an acute to chronic mental load can be impacting our athletes' recovery and performance. So if they're at a period of increased stress due to exams, for example. I'm sure that will be impacting, the athlete's recovery and what we can hit them with and expect them to adapt from. So this downtime is especially important prior to sleep, which we'll further get into shortly here. I think we can also encourage the implementation of relaxation techniques to improve mood and kind of balance out our autonomic nervous system. As you know, a lot of the athletes we work with are very up in the sympathetic zone. Headspace is an app that can be downloaded by us, and they provide free guided meditations if you're looking to encourage some mindful practices for your athletes. Also, just simple deep breathing can promote a similar, parasympathetic response to kind of shift the focus towards recovery. And then life stressor management. So again, I know our athletes have really busy, complex schedules and lives. So I think we also need to understand when it may be appropriate to refer for support. And the encouragement of healthy sleep hygiene. So if sleep is off, then we can expect that to influence mental health metrics as well. Okay, so now I'd like to get into sleep. So sleep is vital for physical and mental recovery, and it's believed to be the single best recovery strategy available to our athletes. So as someone who has dealt with chronic sleep issues, I can speak to how hard it is even to just maintain levels of fitness. It's so important to the recovery of our athletes, and again, we spend about a third of our life in bed. So I think this is a big area where we can educate our athletes to provide better sleep hygiene practices. There are a few things sport-wise that can impact sleep. So if we look at training and competition times, studies have shown that evening exercise, between 7 and 10 p.m. Induced sleep phase delays, whereas morning or earlier afternoon exercise was found to induce advances in sleep phases. So higher intensity exercise in particular spikes cortisol, which can impair the sleep. A lot of us it's impossible for us to avoid these evening training times and competitions, but it's just something to consider. Then when we look at the morning versus evening chronotypes, so some of our athletes are morning athletes, some of them are night owls. And the most dramatic example of where this could become problematic would be a swimmer exposed to early morning training who has an evening chronotype. So they're used to staying up late, but they're required to get up early. So I think to the best of our ability, we need to respect these chronotypes and, if possible, adjust training schedules or demands so the athletes can actually tolerate the training stresses we're imposing on them. And simply elevated training loads themselves can cause disturbances in sleep, along with other wellness metrics like we touched on earlier. So sleep changes have been associated with overreaching and overtraining, for example. So we can monitor things like sleep to potentially if athletes are in these overreach zones. So there are some negative effects on sleep deprivation, and I won't spend too much time on this, but if anyone would like a more comprehensive and research article support list, please reach out. I've got some great tables showing examples of decrements from various sleep deprivation studies. But with deprivation, we can expect impaired brain function, poor cognitive performance. It's associated with obesity and diabetes, unhealthy food cravings as well, and impaired glucose sensitivity, which can impair that glycogen repletion and their muscle glycogen available for exercise. And it can affect their appetite, lead to poor food choices, and it will hinder protein synthesis as well due to these interactions. And also hormonally, we have growth hormone that'll be inhibited, and cortisol increased. So cortisol increases those pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can also hinder our immune function. So illness risks are also evident. Physical performance measures have also been shown to be affected. Sleep education and hygiene practices can have a big impact on sleep, obviously, which we'll get into now. So sleep hygiene basically refers to the practice of behaviors that facilitate sleep versus the behaviors that interfere with sleep. Studies have shown, clinically relevant sleep problems in 16% of athletes in one study, closer to 25% of athletes in other studies, with the rest of the athletes having no or mild clinical sleep issues. A study last year found nearly 60% of athletes had either mild or moderate sleep problems. Athletes with clinically relevant sleep problems are more likely to have poor sleep hygiene practices as well, which we could expect. And the good thing is those sleep behaviors are modifiable. So with this information in mind, addressing issues with those experiencing, clinically significant decrements in sleep can impact a quarter of the athletes we work with. Combine that with educational strategies for those with, more mild sleep issues, and we're impacting the health and recovery of the athletes we work with. So looking at some sleep routine practices, there's some basic expert suggested practices for sleep, which we'll discuss here. So having a consistent bedtime and pre-bed routine is key. So schedule is key. Pre-bed routine wise, it could be like some light reading, some relaxing music, maybe a warm shower or bath. To get to sleep, your body needs to reduce its core temperature. And a lot of researchers suggest something like a warm bath or shower, because once you get out of the warm water exposure, your body heat dissipates away from the core towards the periphery or the skin. So it can help lower your core body temperature after the bath or shower. Consistent wake times, like I said, sleep-ins, like weekends, for example, ideally those are kept to no longer than an hour above their usual wake times. The bedroom itself should be dark as possible and cool. Again, we need our core body temperature to drop. We want to minimize our time in bed, so no TV, computer, or phone use in our bed, and really just reserve the bed for sleeping. And I guess intimacy as well, but really focusing on utilizing the bed just for sleep practices. You're not doing homework in bed, not using the phone in bed, and similarly, not hitting the snooze button, because that does impact sleep quality. Avoiding or limiting that bright and blue light exposure, a couple hours before bed is a typical recommendation. If electronics have to be used in the evening, our athletes can install those color adjusting and blue light reducing softwares. If their home lights have dimmer switches, those can also be great just to help reduce that bright light exposure later on in the evening. I will say that many of our athletes are in a habit of using their phone to kind of unwind in the evenings. I think gradually over time, and this was suggested by our mental performance consultant, Tina, that we can try to kind of gradually shift that habit to something that doesn't involve looking at the screen. So maybe we shift them to encourage them to use their phone for podcasts of a bit more relaxing nature, not something that's too stimulating. Some of that relaxing music, maybe an audiobook. Just also, upon awakening, trying to get some bright or natural light. It just relates to the impact of light on your body's circadian rhythm. There's artificial light lamps, which can also be an artificial source of this natural light. So I know I have one from Costco. It was about $60, but I'll use it when our sunlight's super limited. Or it's also used a lot of times with travel situations. So when athletes wake up, to kind of just reset their circadian rhythm a bit. So getting that bright light exposure immediately upon awakening or shortly upon awakening can help with the circadian rhythm. A lot of our athletes have trouble falling asleep. So ideally, we want our athletes going to bed when they're sleepy. And if they can't sleep within about 20 minutes, it can be helpful for them to go to another room to engage in a relaxing activity before returning to bed. So that kind of goes back to really trying to minimize time spent in bed awake and maximize time spent in bed sleeping. We can also look at implementing meditation or simple deep breathing or other relaxation techniques. Again, there's a lot of apps out there like Headspace, which helps provide some guided meditation. It's may have busier minds in bed due to school, work, sport demands. We've hard for them to kind of shut down a bit. So again, we could encourage them to leave the room and engage in relaxing activities before returning. Imagery is something our mental performance consultants recommend to athletes. So they may suggest athletes to think of a 3-letter word, like car, for example, and then slowly picture every object that they can that starts with each letter of that word. Some additional considerations around sleep would be avoiding and limiting caffeine, especially after lunch. And I think caffeine is especially something to consider with athletes experiencing anxiety issues. They're probably better off just cutting it out over time, because it will further perpetuate those anxiety issues. And as we know, anxiety will affect sleep. Avoiding alcohol, especially right before bed, that will impact sleep quality. Consider avoiding high intensity exercise in the evening. We discussed how that can impact sleep, primarily by the increased cortisol, which does impact sleep quality. One thing we forget about often is our mattress. So most of them last about 10 years max, and they may have allergens. And just keeping in mind that recovery is global, we shouldn't just be focused on the physical. We need to make sure we're reducing mental fatigue because that is important for good sleep. And we need to manage our life stressors. That's something I think we can help our athletes with, is planning out our schedules as well. I think parents can play a role there too. And then again, seeking help for stress and anxiety management if it's needed. If naps are needed, and often they're encouraged for athletes, you should try to keep those to no more than 30 minutes. And they should be timed about 12 hours from the middle of our sleep period. So if your sleep period is 11 p.m. until 7 p.m., the middle of that would be 3 a.m. So around 3 p.m. would be an appropriate nap time. Sleep relating to nutrition. Inadequate caloric intake during the day may impair sleep. So it's important our athletes are maintaining sufficient nutrition throughout their days. At night, avoiding large fatty meals. However, a snack with a higher carbs or a higher glycemic index, like certain types of rices, for example. I think jasmine rice is one of the higher glycemic index rices. And protein, ideally with some tryptophan before bed, may help. Melatonin found naturally occurring in foods can also help. So there's some examples of some foods that have melatonin naturally in them. And avoiding too many liquids in the evening. I think this is a big thing that is prevalent in some athletes. I think it's a lot more effective for athletes to try to maintain hydration practices during the day instead of kind of loading up on the evening end. Because as you know, they may wake up a lot more frequently during the evening with too many liquids. If anyone's unfamiliar with melatonin, it's basically just a hormone that regulates sleep. It's suppressed by bright sun in the morning, and then it increases in production at night with darker light exposure. resulting in sleepiness. Travel-wise, it's important that our athletes get accustomed to new time zones gradually versus just kind of that quick one-day changeover. So a gradual shift over a period like 4 days to start adjusting, sleep and wake cycles according to their destination time zones. And they consider use of those natural melatonin supplements as well, like tart cherry juice. If they are sharing a room, it's great for them to discuss bedtime schedules with the athletes they're rooming with, and also consider the use of earplugs and an eye mask. So this is a great sleep screening questionnaire. Myself and colleagues were at a sport innovation conference in Toronto last year, and we had a sleep physician who utilizes this with a lot of athletes. But it's super basic. Athletes just go to this website here. They fill out a quick questionnaire. It takes about 5 minutes. And then immediately after they fill out that questionnaire, they'll be emailed, they'll be shown the results, and they'll be provided fairly individual recommendations for what they can do to improve their sleep. And there's also links to like a podcast on sleep education. So this can be very valuable. Unfortunately, they can't directly share it with the coach, for example. The results go right to the athlete, but I guess with approval, the athlete could forward it on to the coach. But again, a very helpful resource for athletes. And just to wrap up with a bit more additional and advanced recovery considerations, there's things like active recovery, especially important after our more anaerobic training sessions, just to help remove metabolic byproducts. Foam rolling is a way to reduce muscle tension too, and improve range of motion, and perhaps reduce some inflammation. Therapy as well, massage, physio, chiro, osteo. We can also consider therapies on the mental side of things too. And then we have our more advanced recovery considerations like cold water immersion protocols or contrast bath protocols. I do have a kind of brief one-page document I put together that outlines a lot of the things I mentioned in this presentation though. So if anyone would like to reach out by email, I'm happy to provide those resources. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Craig. I'll definitely get that document from you, and maybe I can post it in the YouTube description box or something, just so coaches can access it. Sure. That's great though, lots of useful tips and tricks, not only for my athletes, but for me as well. I'm really bad for staying on my phone right before bed, so definitely going to implement some of these practices. Does anyone have any questions for Craig? Yeah, sure. Olivier?
Yeah. Hi, guys. Thanks for the presentation. It was pretty interesting. I just have a little question. You said that we should exercise before sleep. So do you have a ballpark of how long before sleep we should exercise? Like, is it 2 hours or 5 hours or?
I don't. I think the main thing is, and again, this isn't always possible, but trying to limit the higher intensity exercise close to bedtimes. I don't have an idea of how long. I would assume the longer the worse, because that could result in higher cortisol accumulations. But yeah, timing, I'm not sure.
Like, would 2 to 3 hours before be enough time? Like, because some of our training happens. I coach climbing, and we coach some people that don't train in the day, like some teenagers who go to school before like in the day. So they train during the evening, and then some of them might have to go to sleep like at 8 or 9 or before and they would train from 6 to 8 or from like that time. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the longer away from bedtime, the better. So that study I was referring to, they showed delays in sleep phase for athletes that were training between 7 and 10 p.m. So maybe the athletes training closer to 7 p.m. didn't experience any sleep issues. And I'm sure a lot of it's also individual based on how easily athletes sleep. But yeah, I would, like I said, probably the further away from bedtime, the better, but it could also be very individualized. So maybe the best thing to do would be maybe to talk to the athletes or just make sure they're sleeping okay. And if they aren't, then maybe there's something we can do to help. But at the end of the day, it also comes down to just the nature of timing and what we can do.
Yeah, we will definitely make them go through the questionnaire or something like this, or just maybe do our own small questionnaire.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Good question. Any other questions? Yeah, Jake.
Yeah, I just had a question around the tracking software, Craig. I was curious what platform that's on. I know you mentioned they receive it via text, and then does that kind of go to like a fillable Excel sheet, or is that program, I guess, available to the public, or is that something you've kind of created?
So at the Sports Center Atlantic, we have access to Conduct, which is a modern software. So I'll use that with a couple of groups. So the texts go out through the Conduct software, and then I export all the data from the Conduct website and then make those reports in Excel. Although, yeah, there's also some reports available in Conduct. They're just a little bit limited.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. All right, thank you.
All right. Any last questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and thank you to Craig for the presentation. As mentioned earlier, this will be posted on YouTube, so if you need to go back and check out any slides or gather any more information, that will be accessible on our YouTube page. So that's Canadian Sports Center Atlantic Coaches channel. And all of our previous sessions are posted on there as well. Our next coach socialization session is this evening at 7 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. So we'll have a mental performance consultant named Ashley. She'll be coming on and discussing how we can work on our mental performance during this time of isolation and how to be mentally tough. So definitely check out that. And then we have another session tomorrow afternoon with a dietitian, Angela, who will be talking about relative energy deficiency in sport. So a variety of topics. Definitely encourage you to check them out and check out our YouTube page for our past presentations. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks Craig again for presenting. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to Craig about this presentation. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.